Imagine a night so complete that you cannot see your own hand in front of your face. No streetlights, no glow from a distant city on the horizon, no small blue lights blinking from devices in the corner of a room. Picture a cluster of low houses pressed together at the edge of a forest, somewhere in Europe, 700 or 800 years ago. The sun has slipped below the tree line. The last color drains from the sky, and within an hour, the world these people know will vanish into a darkness so absolute that it is almost impossible for a modern person to imagine. This was the ordinary reality for the vast majority of human beings who ever lived. For medieval villagers, night was not simply the end of a day. It was a separate world, with its own rules, its own dangers, its own quiet routines, and its own strange comforts. And what they actually did during those long hours of darkness is far more surprising and far more human than most people expect. This is a channel devoted to exactly these forgotten details, the physical reality of how ordinary people survived the world before modern technology. If that is the kind of history you find fascinating, consider subscribing, because everything that follows is going to change the way you picture the past after sunset. To understand the medieval night, you first have to understand just how dark it truly was. In our world, artificial light is everywhere and effectively free. A single modern bulb produces more steady light than an entire medieval household might see in a week of evenings. But for a peasant family in the 12th or 13th century, light after dark was expensive, fragile, and often dangerous. It had to be made, tended, and rationed. And so the fundamental rhythm of village life was shaped by a simple fact. When the sun went down, useful light largely went with it. The main source of light and warmth in most homes was the hearth fire. In the humblest dwellings, this was often a fire built directly on a central stone or a patch of packed earth in the middle of the single room, with the smoke drifting upward to escape through a hole in the roof or through gaps in the thatch. Chimneys, as we know them, spread only gradually, and for a long stretch of the medieval period, the poorest homes had none at all. The fire was the heart of the house, in the most literal sense. It cooked the food, dried the damp, kept away the worst of the cold, and threw a flickering orange glow across the faces of everyone gathered near it. Beyond the fire, villagers relied on small, improvised sources of flame. One of the most common and most affordable was the rushlight. Historians describe how people gathered common rushes from wet ground, stripped away most of the outer skin, and soaked the soft inner pith in whatever fat they could spare, often the melted grease left over from cooking. Once dried, these fat-soaked rushes could be lit at one end and clipped at an angle into a simple metal holder. A single rushlight of modest length might burn for perhaps a quarter of an hour or a little longer, giving a small wavering flame that was just enough to move around a room or finish a task by. They were cheap, but they were also brief, and they demanded constant attention. In some regions, particularly where oil could be pressed from plants or rendered from fish and other sources, small oil lamps offered another option. These were often simple vessels, sometimes little more than a shallow dish holding oil and a floating or resting wick, and they too gave a modest, flickering flame. The type of light a household relied upon depended heavily on geography, on what materials were locally abundant, and on how much a family could afford to spend. A coastal community with access to fish oil, an inland village surrounded by grazing animals and their tallow, and a household near beekeepers all had slightly different relationships with the dark. What united them was scarcity. Whatever the source, artificial light remained a thing to be conserved, and the fire remained the true center of the evening. It is worth pausing on the quality of that firelight itself, because it was nothing like the even, shadowless illumination we take for granted. Firelight moves. It surges and dims as the flames rise and settle, throwing long shadows that sway across the walls and ceiling. Faces lit by a hearth are half in gold and half in darkness, and the edges of the room dissolve into black. This constantly shifting, living light shaped how people saw one another and how they experienced their own homes after dark. It is not difficult to understand why a world lit this way was also a world so rich in stories of shadows, spirits, and things half glimpsed at the edge of sight. Candles existed, but for ordinary people they were a luxury to be used carefully. The most common household candles were made of tallow, rendered from animal fat, and they smoked, dripped, and gave off a strong smell as they burned. The clean, bright candles made of beeswax that we might picture from paintings were costly, and their use was concentrated in churches, monasteries, and the halls of the wealthy. For a village family, the idea of burning several candles at once, simply to brighten a room for comfort, would have seemed almost unthinkable. Light was not decoration. It was a resource, and it was spent with care. Because darkness came early and light was precious, the evening did not stretch endlessly the way our nights often do. In the deep of winter, in the higher latitudes of Europe, the sun might set in the middle of the afternoon and not rise again until well into the following morning. This left an enormous span of darkness, far longer than the hours a body needs for sleep. And this simple fact, the sheer length of the winter night, shaped one of the most fascinating aspects of how people actually lived after dark. Before exploring what filled those hours, it helps to picture the space itself. The typical peasant home was small, often a single room, sometimes divided into two. The walls might be built of timber frames filled with woven sticks and daub, a mixture of clay, straw, and other materials. The floor was frequently packed earth, perhaps strewn with rushes or straw that could be swept out and replaced. Furniture was sparse: a table, a bench or two, a chest for storing valuables, and simple bedding. In many regions and many households, the family did not sleep alone in the sense we might imagine. Beds, where they existed as proper frames, were shared. More often, people slept on straw-filled mattresses or pallets laid on the floor, or on low platforms, huddled together for warmth. And in a great many rural dwellings, the family shared their living space with animals. In parts of medieval Europe, a common form of house, sometimes called a longhouse, placed people at one end and livestock at the other, sometimes with only a low partition between them. The animals were valuable, they were vulnerable to theft and predators, and they were, quite practically, a source of heat. The warmth radiating from a few cattle on a cold night was not a small thing. To modern sensibilities, this may sound strange, even unpleasant, but within the logic of that world, it was sensible, resourceful, and entirely ordinary. Now, into this world of small fires, shared beds, and animal warmth, the night arrived, and the first thing that shaped the villagers' evening was often a sound, carried across the fields and rooftops, the ringing of a bell. In many towns and organized settlements across medieval Europe, an evening bell signaled a moment of transition. This practice is closely tied to the word curfew, which historians trace to an old term meaning, quite literally, to cover the fire. The purpose was intensely practical. In a world of timber houses, thatched roofs, and open flames, fire was one of the most feared disasters imaginable. A single, unattended blaze could leap from home to home and consume an entire community in a night. And so, the ringing of the curfew bell was, in many places, a reminder to bank or cover the household fire, to reduce the risk of a stray spark setting the whole village alight while everyone slept. Historians note that the details of curfew varied enormously from place to place and changed over time, and it is often associated in popular memory with specific rulers and specific towns. What matters for our purposes is the underlying reality it reflects. Night was understood as a time to withdraw indoors, to secure the home, and to reduce the dangers that darkness brought. The bell marked the boundary between the busy, visible world of the day and the quieter, more hidden world of the night. Once the fire was banked and the door was shut, what did people actually do in those dark hours? Here we come to one of the most intriguing possibilities that scholars have explored about historical sleep itself. Researchers who have studied references to sleep in old documents, letters, diaries, and other records have argued that, before the age of artificial lighting, many people in Europe may not have slept in one single unbroken stretch the way most of us aim to today. Instead, the historian Roger E. Kirch, in a widely discussed body of research, gathered numerous references to what people sometimes called a first sleep and a second sleep. According to this interpretation, people would go to bed not long after dark, sleep for a few hours, and then wake naturally in the deep middle of the night for a period of quiet wakefulness before drifting back into a second stretch of sleep that lasted until morning. It is important to be careful here. This is a scholarly interpretation drawn from surviving written references, and historians continue to discuss how widespread the pattern was, how it varied by region and season, and how strictly it applied to poorer rural households whose lives are less richly documented. But the evidence that such a pattern existed, at least in some times and places, is genuinely striking. And if we take it seriously, it opens a window onto a version of the night that feels almost dreamlike to modern eyes. Picture that middle of the night waking. The fire has burned low, a soft red bed of embers rather than open flame. The house is quiet. Beyond the walls, the true darkness of a world without electric light presses in. In that hushed interval, according to the surviving references, people did all sorts of ordinary things. Some simply lay in the warmth and rested, half awake, letting their thoughts wander. Some prayed, and indeed, devotional texts from the period sometimes offered guidance for what to reflect upon during these quiet night hours. Some rose to tend the fire, check on a child, or step outside briefly. Couples talked. Neighbors who shared close quarters might speak softly across the dark. And then, when the interval passed, they returned to sleep. Whether or not every household followed this exact pattern, the deeper point stands. The medieval night was not a dead, empty stretch to be simply endured until dawn. It had a texture and a rhythm of its own, and there was work to be done too. This is a good moment to pause, because if you are enjoying this journey into the hidden hours of the past, subscribing to the channel genuinely helps more of these forgotten stories reach the people who love them. Now, back into the dark. For many villagers, especially through the long nights of autumn and winter, the hours after dark were not only for sleep, they were also for the quiet, endless labor that kept a household running And much of this labor was the kind that could be done, at least in part, by feel and firelight. Spinning thread is the classic example. Before the spinning wheel became widespread, and even alongside it, women across medieval Europe spun fiber into thread, using a simple hand tool called a distaff and a spindle. It was work that could be picked up in spare moments and set down again, work that did not always demand bright, focused light. Around the low glow of the hearth, hands that knew their task well could keep turning wool or flax into thread, while the mind was free to listen, to talk, or to rest. The production of thread and cloth was one of the great ongoing labors of the pre-modern world, and a significant share of it was done in exactly these dim domestic hours. There were other quiet tasks that suited the evening: mending clothing, repairing tools and simple equipment, carving or whittling small wooden objects, preparing food for the next day, tending to the fire and the animals, sharpening, cleaning, sorting, and the 100 small chores that a self-sufficient household required. None of these needed the strong light of noon. They needed only steady hands, familiar work, and enough of a glow to see the essentials. Somewhere in the early part of the evening came the last meal of the day, and it too was shaped by darkness and by season. For most village families, food was simple and repetitive, built around what could be grown, stored, and stretched. A thick pottage, a kind of slow-cooked stew of grains, and whatever vegetables were available, simmered in a single pot over the fire, and formed the backbone of many a household's diet. Bread, cheese where it could be made or afforded, and preserved food such as salted or dried provisions filled out the table through the lean months. Meat was far less common on a poor family's plate than many people assume, and it appeared more often as a flavoring or a rare treat than as a daily staple. To drink, ale brewed in the household or the village was widespread across much of northern Europe, valued partly because the brewing process made it safer than much of the available water, while wine held a similar place in the south. The evening meal was not an elaborate affair, but gathered around the same fire that gave light and warmth. It was one of the fixed points that gave the night its shape. But perhaps the most human part of the medieval evening was not the work at all. It was the gathering. In rural communities across medieval and early modern Europe, historians describe a tradition of evening gatherings, particularly common in the colder months, when families or neighbors would come together in a single warm space to pass the long dark hours. In some regions, this custom carried its own names in later centuries, and while the documentation is richer for the early modern period than for the earliest medieval centuries, the underlying practice reflects something deeply rooted in village life. There were sound practical reasons for it. Gathering in one home meant sharing a single fire and a single source of light, saving fuel and rushlights across several families at once. But it was also something warmer than mere economy. Around that shared fire, people talked. They exchanged news, which, in a world without newspapers or rapid communication, traveled by mouth from village to village and traveler to traveler. They discussed the harvest, the weather, the state of the animals, the doings of the local lord, the affairs of neighbors. Older members of the community passed down knowledge, the practical wisdom of when to plant and when to reap, how to treat a sick animal, how to read the signs of the coming season. Skills were taught by demonstration in the firelight, as young hands learned to spin or to carve by watching those who had done it 1,000 times. And there were stories. This is one of the great quiet truths of the pre-modern night. In a world where most people could not read and where books were rare and costly, Storytelling was one of the central pleasures and one of the central ways that culture survived. Folk tales, legends, the deeds of heroes, accounts of saints, warnings dressed as tales, songs, riddles, and jokes filled the dark evenings. A skilled storyteller was valued. The old tales carried memory, morality, warning, and wonder, and they were passed from one generation to the next around exactly these hearths. Much of the folklore later collected and written down had lived for centuries in the oral tradition of these firelit nights. There was music, too, of the simple, homemade kind. Singing needed no equipment beyond a voice, and songs marked the seasons, the work, the festivals, and the sorrows of village life. In this way, the long evenings were not only endured, they were, in their own modest fashion, lived and enjoyed. Faith wove through all of it. The rhythm of the medieval day and night was deeply shaped by religion. Bells did not only mark curfew. In and around monasteries, a structured cycle of prayer divided the entire day and night into fixed hours, and the monastic community rose in the deep of the night for prayers in the darkness. For ordinary villagers, life was not governed by that strict schedule, but faith still framed the passage into night. Prayers before sleep, a sense of entrusting oneself to protection through the dangerous dark, and the deep association between night, mortality, and the divine were part of how people understood the hours after sunset. To lie down in the dark was, in a small way, to rehearse a greater surrender, and the prayers of the evening reflected that. And it must be said plainly, night was also feared. For medieval people, the darkness beyond the firelight was genuinely dangerous and genuinely frightening, and their caution was entirely rational. Without light, movement was risky. Roads and paths that were merely inconvenient by day became treacherous by night, and a fall, a wrong turn, or a river crossing in the dark could be deadly. Beyond practical danger lay the realm of belief. The night was widely associated with spirits, restless souls, and supernatural threats. In a world where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was understood very differently from today, the dark hours were the time when unseen forces were felt to be closest. Many of the protective customs, the prayers, the charms, the reluctance to travel after dark, grew from this understanding. To modern eyes, some of these beliefs may seem like superstition, but within their world, they were a coherent way of making sense of real dangers and real mysteries. There were also human dangers. In towns especially, the night could be a time of crime, and communities responded with organized watches. Historians describe how many medieval towns maintained a night watch, groups of men who patrolled the streets after dark, watching for fire, for thieves, and for disturbances, and calling out the hours or the all clear as they went. The presence of the watch and the general expectation that respectable people would be indoors after the evening bell reflected a shared understanding that the night belonged to a different and more dangerous order of things than the day. The moon, in all of this, mattered enormously. On a clear night, with a full or near full moon, the world outside was transformed. Suddenly, there was enough silvery light to move about, to travel a familiar road, to work outdoors if the season demanded it. A bright moon could turn a dangerous night into a manageable one, and people were acutely aware of the moon's phases in a way that most modern city dwellers have entirely lost. A moonless, overcast night was a very different thing, a darkness so total that stepping outside meant stepping into near blindness. This constant awareness of the sky, of the phase of the moon and the position of the stars, was simply part of being a person who lived close to the natural world without artificial light to erase it. The children of the village lived inside this same rhythm. For the young, the evening was a time of learning by simply being present, absorbing the talk of adults, the songs, the tales, and the practical skills demonstrated in the firelight. Little ones would have been settled to sleep early, tucked among the family bedding in the shared warmth of the single room, while older children took on their share of the quiet evening chores. There were no separate bedrooms, no private spaces of the kind we now expect. The whole family lived, worked, ate, and slept within a few close paces of one another, and the night drew them together rather than apart. In such conditions, the stories told after dark were not only entertainment, they were how a child first learned the shape of the world, its dangers and its heroes, its rules and its wonders, long before any of them would ever see the inside of a book. Season shaped everything. The summer night and the winter night were almost different experiences of life. In summer, when the days were long and the demands of farming were at their peak, people worked from very early to very late, and the short nights were mostly for exhausted sleep. There was little leisure in the growing season, but in the depths of winter, when the fields lay frozen or fallow and outdoor work was limited, the enormous nights had to be filled. This was the season of gathering, of storytelling, of indoor crafts, of rest and repair, of festivals that punctuated the darkness with feasting and light. The great midwinter celebrations, with their fires and candles and communal warmth, can be understood in part as a human answer to the longest and darkest nights of the year, a deliberate pushing back against the cold and the dark with fellowship and flame. When we step back and take in the whole picture, we can see the shape of what medieval villagers actually did at night. They secured their homes and banked their fires against disaster. They gathered around a shared hearth for warmth, light, and company. They worked at the quiet tasks that firelight allowed, especially the endless business of spinning and mending. They talked, taught, sang, and told the stories that carried their culture forward. Many of them, if the surviving evidence is read correctly, slept in two distinct stretches with a strange, peaceful island of wakefulness in the middle. They prayed, they feared, they watched the moon, and they lived by a rhythm utterly shaped by the presence or absence of light. And this way of life had real consequences for their bodies and for their culture. The close, smoky interiors, warmed by fire and shared with animals, came at a cost. The smoke from open hearths in poorly ventilated rooms was hard on the lungs and eyes over a lifetime. Crowded sleeping arrangements, while warm, could help illness spread. The general hardship of a life lived close to the edge of survival, with limited nutrition and constant physical labor, meant that health was fragile and that lifespans, on average, were far shorter than our own, especially given the high rates of death in infancy and childhood that historians consistently emphasize for the pre-modern world. These were not gentle times, and it would be a mistake to romanticize them. Yet within those hard conditions, people built a rich and resilient way of living through the dark. The rhythms of the medieval night shaped language, folklore, custom, and community. The stories told around those fires became the folk tales and legends that scholars later gathered, and that still echo in the tales we tell children today. The communal evenings knit villages together, sustaining the bonds of mutual aid on which survival depended. The deep familiarity with the natural cycles of moon and season produced a kind of environmental knowledge that we have very largely lost, and the simple, patient acceptance of darkness as a normal and inevitable part of life reveals an adaptability that is, in its own way, deeply impressive. What ended this world was, above all, light. Slowly at first, and then with astonishing speed, better and cheaper sources of artificial light began to change the human relationship with the night. Improved candles and lamps, then gas lighting in the cities, and finally, in a transformation that arrived only a little more than a century ago in the broad sweep of human history, widespread electric light. With the flick of a switch, the great darkness that had governed human life for all of its previous existence was pushed back. The night stopped being a separate world with its own rules and became instead simply a dimmer extension of the day, available for work and leisure alike. And with that change, much of what we have described quietly disappeared. The banked fire and the curfew bell became history. The segmented sleep, if it truly was as widespread as some historians suggest, gradually gave way to the single, consolidated night's sleep that we now consider natural, as artificial light allowed people to stay up later and compress their rest into one block. The firelit gathering, the veillée, the shared evening of spinning and storytelling faded as light became abundant and, later, as new forms of entertainment arrived to fill the hours. The deep, practical awareness of the moon and stars dimmed as their light was drowned out by our own. There is something worth sitting with in all of this. For nearly the whole of human existence, the descent of night was one of the great unchangeable facts of life, a daily encounter with darkness that shaped how people slept, worked, gathered, believed, and feared. The medieval villager, sitting by a small fire in a dark room while the true night pressed against the walls, was living a version of the human experience that stretches back tens of thousands of years, and that we, in the glow of our screens and streetlights, have almost entirely left behind. It is one of the most profound and least noticed transformations in the story of our species. So the next time the lights go out unexpectedly, and you find yourself in genuine darkness, reaching for a phone or a candle, pause for just a moment. That darkness, that silence, that sudden narrowing of the world to the small circle of whatever flame you can find, is the world your ancestors knew every single night of their lives. They filled it with work and warmth, with stories and song, with prayer and fear and quiet companionship. And understanding how they did it tells us something not only about the medieval past, but about how astonishingly recent and how astonishingly bright our own age truly is. If this journey into the hidden hours of history moved you or taught you something new, consider subscribing to the channel so that these forgotten corners of ordinary life can keep coming to light. There are countless more of them waiting in the dark, and every one of them has something to tell us about who we were and who we still are.